Chris Coniaris has been a yoga teacher for 20 years with over 40 years of meditation and 30 years of hatha yoga experience. His lifelong interest in philosophy, the outdoors, and athletics influence his teaching. Chris teaches weekly yoga and meditation classes in Tucson, Arizona, as well as workshops and teacher training throughout the U.S. He weaves philosophy and refined experience into his classes that emphasize the importance of breathing in hatha yoga. His concise, practical explanations and enthusiasm inspire students to deepen their own experience. Okay, good morning, Chris. It's nice to see you again.
Morning, Sarah Joy.
Thank you for joining me for the conversations on the Bhagavad-Gita and social justice.
A favorite topic of mine, so I appreciate
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time, and I know we've already spoken in other settings about the Bhagavad-Gita. So I'm wondering if you can say, for the person new to reading the Bhagavad-Gita, given that it's such an immense text, where do you recommend they start?
I suggest strongly that people new to the text start with a simple translation that has no commentary, where they can actually read the story for what it is, a story. It's a short story, not massive. The volumes and volumes that we see are commentary. So I think getting the very basics of the story of the Bhagavad Gita is very helpful before you start trying to dive in and analyze in depth what's the deeper meaning or what is the context of the different parts.
Mm-hmm. And when a person is reading that, if they, as students tell me, and have said here at the Northwest Yoga Conference as well, they open the book, they read some words that are aversive to them, like war and fight and battle, and they close the book and say, well, that's not what I learned in my yoga teacher training. I learned ahimsa, which means nonviolence. What do you recommend to the person who's opened it, been shocked by it, closed it, and put it away?
To really analyze what is the cause of that, who's reacting, what's reacting, and why. The message of the Gita that's often lost is it is not a set of commandments. You know, the Gita is not telling you what to do. It's really giving you a series of choices. And the whole text is laid out that way with with Arjuna, the main protagonist, being spoken to, and really not being told, this is the path, follow this way, these actions, but rather you must learn to liberate yourself from illusion. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's a means that they have to begin to look at the text in a deeper way. So I would still tell them, put that aside, just read the text. You know, you don't watch Superman, you know, you've never watched a movie or any show or read a book that had war or evil in it. Mm-hmm. You know, basically get over it and read the text so that you can begin to understand its meaning.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing you said there in the first part of your response, which I appreciated the contemplation, the pause you had before saying it. You said, well, look at who's having the reaction, or the part of us having that reaction. So not just look at the text and sort of forge forward, but recognize, where does reaction come from? Who's having it? What is it about? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, this I would say, once someone has the basic story, you know, the basic context of the chapters as they go into depth, then when you do read the text and try to analyze in detail, to me, very quickly it becomes evident that this text is meant to be a mirror. It's meant to be something that reflects us. And then you can begin to discover, some of the deeper meanings as to who the characters represent when you look at the text as being, instead of an outward exploration, an exploration of the battles that go on within us.
Yeah, and what might you say to in the first chapter, Arjuna's despondency? How are we to look at our own capacity for despondency if this is a mirror of something on the inside?
I think it's something that, again, many people in yoga and certainly social justice, recognize that for many of us, we have to get to a point of desperation before we're willing to really look at the deeper parts, the parts that we've hidden away very nicely and found ways to maneuver around addressing.
Yeah, I think our kind of contemporary culture in yoga, what's been emerging as I'm watching it, and even though I'm heavily involved in yoga and social justice, I consider myself kind of lightly involved in the yoga industry as an industry. I'm not very adept at social media. I don't get all that engaged in that way. But what I've watched as a marketing trend or a trend to help maybe bring more people into yoga is the promise of bliss in yoga, not the promise of certain despondency. So I wonder what you think about that, because in my own life, certain despondency was actually occurring. And when I say certain despondency, I mean like the human condition will experience despondency if it wants to wake up, or if the conditions of our lives are such that symptoms will manifest, and those will feel like despondency if we're out of step with our current culture, which in the yoga community, again, looks like bliss, not despair. What might you say about that?
Again, the Gita, to me, really addresses that directly. I think it's in chapter 12 where they talk about Krishna discusses that if you can just see unity, just immerse yourself in that. You don't need to do anything else. Most of us can't do that, at all times. And it says, if you can't do that, meditate. Because that's really one of those ways to overcome those veils of illusion that we can really begin to see truth. And then it goes further and says, if you don't have the discipline for that meditation, which again is a very dry path without a lot of good feedback along the way, without a lot of reward for each day of practice, perhaps. It might be despondency for months. What it says is, if not those, do selfless service, because that's the sure way. And many times throughout the text, Arjuna's implored to act and to recognize that serving others without putting yourself first is really the easy way, because we get instant gratification in a way. Again, we know those involved in the field, particularly, nothing makes you feel better than helping someone, and especially, I think for those who've experienced it, helping someone that's in a situation where they're not ever going to be able to repay you, because that's another thing that the Gita very much gets into is talking about giving and offering, that these can be done with different attitudes, with different forces working within us. And I think, as you're saying now, in this current climate, often it becomes very adversarial. We just want to do this because we're right. And although I may agree with you, we shouldn't put up this wall and make the other person either unable to speak or, feel defensive. The idea, again, is breaking down these barriers and recognizing, again, the way the Gita would say it is, we're free when we see everyone in ourselves and ourselves in everyone, which mean, again, we see the beauty in others, but we also can recognize things that, aren't leading to good, and they're inside us as well. And that's that dichotomy that the Gita, I think, really brings alive well, where it has a basic story, which again is often offensive at many levels.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it describes the caste system and very much limiting their right to work in different areas and to experience life as other people. Things that I would never really agree with as a societal norm. But the deeper meaning of that, again, that's the part that is the yoga in the Gita.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that was so well said. I really appreciate it very much. And there's a lot, that was like a concentrated amount of information in a small period of time. So I want to go back to, I'm accustomed to that with you, but since listeners are listening and they can't see or feel our body language, I want to go back to one of the things you said there, which was how meditation can sometimes feel like a dry practice without like prompt results, but selfless service seems to have like an immediate return, a feeling of return right away. And of the two, which do you experience as more likely to cause grasping and attachment, meditation or selfless service? And what can people do about it?
The recognition and foremost message really in the Gita on karma yoga and action, doing selfless service, is you are obligated to act, but you are not empowered to control the outcome, nor should you be overly concerned with that. You know, and I think that's the place where so many people get lost and the ego gets involved. I want to do this thing. These people are being unfairly treated, and instead of looking at what action can I take that would empower them, change the situation, what I want to do is alleviate their suffering. So I want to go out and just push back on the side that's cornered them, as opposed to mediating the situation where the conflict dissolves. And that Gita, again, in every direction, it keeps pointing to the conflict that has to be resolved is within us.
Yes, yeah. And even with that attachment to the outcome of our actions, I'm also experiencing students, maybe a little bit newer to the practice of meditation, feeling attached to certain mind states or an idea of what it's going to be like if they could meditate better, if they were good at meditation. And there's a kind of profound lens shift required by Westerners to either meditate according to the Gita, take selfless service according to the Gita, practice devotion according to the Gita, and come into states of contemplation according to the Gita. And that lens shift is something that I'm really interested in fostering for people, like helping them to actually shift it, because I see that shift of lens lessens our immersion in Western conditioning and opens up to the deep and timeless teachings in the Gita. What might you say about that?
Yes, I agree, and that is something, again, also addressed in the Gita. This idea, I think, one that's helpful is for where Krishna is talking about, don't be confused by death and killing, and refers to the body, again, in this life as being like a pair of clothes that we wear. And I think when you look at this, instead of as the outward big story, as the small story of the conflict within us, that becomes all of those things that psychology looks at. What part of us are we hiding in the shadow and not addressing? So I think very much it demands, and again, recognizes that battle, again, that we're doing maybe to help someone else, we have to recognize that as a reflection of something going on within. And the more we can see those things inside, the more effective the more compassionate our actions will be to others. Because it's not going to be coming as I'm helping you or I'm doing something, again, this sense of separation. It becomes much more a sense of one as something that I can do. So much more direct.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, as you're talking about the shadow just there, I am remembering that some of the questions I asked for our telesummit companions in my email to you guys beforehand, I haven't been able to ask in the other conversations yet. And one of those is, what's the role of the blind seer in the Bhagavad-Gita?
Yes. It really represents that blindness in us when it comes to following our individual ego-based sense desires. So that's the key is, and throughout the Gita, the message is you have to learn not to be driven by those desires, not to try to stop them, because the recognition in the Gita is that we are, at our hearts, our deepest driving desire, you know, because our desire determines our will. You know, our will determines our action, which then determines the destiny and comes back to determine what our driving desire is. And the Gita points out the whole message is the will is where we can intercede. So that discipline and not just sliding towards what's easy, what's pleasant, and what's gratifying is the message of the Gita.
Yeah, and so then another question is, I'm going to ask this question with a scenic turnout. The question is, what is the role of the teacher then in Krishna? And the scenic turnout to precede my question is this. I was teaching yesterday here at the conference a course on yoga and social justice, which I very much enjoyed. I felt super honored. The people were amazing. They were willing to have the conversation. And one of the things that we talk about in this conversation was that Arjuna then asked for his teacher. And I asked the students, how are you going to ask for your teacher? Where are you going to find your teacher? What is the role of teacher in your life? And one of the responses to that, which I find a lot in the yoga and social justice community, and I endorse this response, a response is the teacher is in the other, in the pain or vulnerability or manifestation in them that reminds us of that in ourselves, and that the teacher can show up as the student if we're open to that non-hierarchical view. But I also was underlining for people that I think we do need a formal teacher, a place where our integrity and clarity and wisdom get held or fostered by someone who's maybe more developed or longer practiced or more awakened, and so that we don't end up falling into the little margins in our minds that are like, I'm now doing a good job serving this person, or this person needs me a lot more and I'm the only one who can help them, or that student's kind of aversive. I'm just going to like distance myself from them a little bit. That I'd like us to be able to lessen, and I think we do need a formal teacher for that sort of process. What's your feeling on this?
Yes. I would say the way the Gita addresses that, until you find the ultimate teacher is definitely inside. Until we can be in constant contact with that, we need to have some outside influences. And again, I think that finding that is always going to be a challenge. You know, in the Gita, the Bhagavad-Gita itself is a part of a much larger story, the Mahabharata, and that actually has stories that leads up to how the kingdom was lost, how Arjuna winds up on the battlefield with Krishna as his charioteer, but his Krishna being the Lord, but his powers and his armies are on the other side. So there's, again, much lore that goes into that in story, and part of it is in the story, he makes a choice early on that he would rather have this divine guidance and teaching as opposed to all of the powers that could have been offered. So again, making that choice, I think that finding and having that teacher is the most valuable thing. You know, I think, again, in yoga, it's very easy to see who excels in an asana practice. And again, to perhaps go to a young, flexible teacher who's very knowledgeable, because you can see that. And perhaps it's very easy to miss the wisdom that's coming from somebody who's over there and doesn't move so well and seems to mostly sit around. So I do think that internal choice to seek out is so important.
Yeah, you reminded me of several things there, but I want to ask you if you might, on a personal level, tell us how you met Shankarnarayana Joyce and how you came to feel that he could be a teacher for you. You also introduced me to him, and I am very grateful.
I met Shankarnarayana in India when I was over studying with Pattabhi Joyce. I had heard from other students of Ashtanga Yoga that there was a professor at the university who, if approached, would teach philosophy and texts to a group of Western students, and that he was truly knowledgeable in the traditions and a great teacher. So I went out of my way, like the first day or two that I was there, and found him. I had his address and everything, found him and asked him, got some of the students. So started studying the Yoga Sutras with him, and quickly asked him to help me with my pranayama and meditation practice. So we then began, he teaches pretty much strictly one-on-one when it comes to your individual yoga practice. So that was how we forged our relationship.
And was that about 25 years ago?
That sounds like about 25 years ago, yes.
And you and I met almost 20 years ago.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I was lucky to meet Acharya about 11 or 12 years ago. So, yeah. I was talking yesterday with one of the students asked me in the class, for example, about hugging our students, and I became very poignant about it, actually. I was remembering when Acharya teaches, and at the end of a session, he stands up, we stand up, and there's this enormous feeling of love and respect towards him, but he's not dashing off to hug each of us. That there's a quality, a sattvic quality in him that is, he has some ways he lives that preserves that sattvic quality, and one of them is that we're not dashing about hugging each other. It's not that I don't think Westerners can hug each other in yoga classes, but I was pointing to the intention. For sometimes we want to hug somebody because we're uncomfortable and we're at the end of our toolkit. We say, I don't know what to do, can I just hug you? And the Westerner is supposed to interpret that as care, but it can sometimes feel invasive. And I just, even talking about Acharya and his presence and that resonance or transmission, I feel still his enormous wisdom and kindness without him ever having hugged me or me hugged him. I have a sense of him in my body memory. Do you have a sense of that for yourself, the place he holds in you?
Yes. For me, I think it was in 1999, I got to go over for about 6 weeks and travel with a group of just 3 other Western students and one of his Indian students and Acharya's wife. So since that time, really, and it really feels like that connection is ever present. Because, again, I think what he offers at the deepest level is really, like the Gita, a mirror. He himself, as you said, has a very disciplined life that allows him to reflect that sattva, to, I think, show you that calmness, those qualities, again, of caring without having to be outwardly showing. So those things, I think, again, just really become a part of you, as opposed to a series of practices. And that's very much what I have experienced with Acharya, is kind of like what I was saying from chapter 12 from the Gita. You know, if you get it, I don't need to teach you anything. Just be there, be in bliss and recognize the unity. You're going to help other people because there'll be no other way. If you can't, meditate, you know. And if you need me to give you a schedule from sunrise to sunset and during your sleep period, I'll be that detailed. I'll give you all the help you need, but recognize the truest, let's say, guide to what your dietary needs are not going to be some standardized Ayurvedic diet. They're going to be particular to you.
Yeah.
So I love that he embraces at the first level that broad ability to let each student be their individual self, but depending on the needs will also offer as specific guidance and help as anyone needs, to the point of telling them literally what gems to wear on their body and clothes type to wear.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It brings up another question that arose yesterday and comes up in the yoga community these days, which is, I was talking about trauma-informed, brain-sensitive teaching tools, and one of the students in the conversation recommended that teachers could tell students to just trust their body as a way to be trauma-sensitive. We should, as teachers, tell our students to trust their bodies. Now, this might sound a little bit sassy for me to say this in the yoga industry, but a couple things that get dismantled when people have a history of trauma. One is the ability to trust your body, and I do want to help reawaken that. But also with the developmental trauma process, where now certain brain centers are more anxious or activated, what I have found is that if I'm asking my students to make a choice in class, like choose this or choose that, or lesser or greater degrees of dynamic effort, but their brains are dysregulated when I ask them the question, the dysregulated brain provides the response for them. So if they're rajasic, they often choose a rajasic response. If they're tamasic, they choose a tamasic response. And my sense as a teacher, we call this trauma stewardship, as a trauma steward and a yoga teacher, my sense is I want to help reawaken the student's capacity to feel their body intelligence, but that I actually have a process to help people get into that experience gently and from within, yet they need guidance from the outside if trust in their body was dismantled. And if I'm going to ask them to make a choice, I want to ask it when I've helped their brain to be as present as possible to the here and now, rather than as kind of overrun by their history into rajas and tamas as brain states. What comes to mind as I say this? I know you're a teacher who holds the seat of the teacher very well and looks at students in the classroom and wants to help them to really get the yoga. And you don't tend to have a back off and be mousy style. And sometimes you're willing to roar like a lion and kind of wake up somebody's attention to come to the yoga.
I think what you described is very well fits why Hatha Yoga is such a valuable practice and why there needs to be such an emphasis on how it is practiced as opposed to just what practices are done. The tradition of Hatha Yoga is not so concerned about muscles and bones, and really forces and directs the practitioner's awareness to the two forces of the breath, prana and apana. And what I have found is that in all of us, because we all have some degree of that disconnect from our body and mind, that methodology of focusing on the energies of the breath bring us to a here and now and help that mind-body connection reestablish the true healing nature that should be constant. Mm-hmm. You know, if we aren't putting up barriers, if something's not in the way, the mind-body does heal itself all the time. Mm-hmm. So I agree very much with you that the essence of it is, yes, we want people to be able to turn to their body for wisdom, but we do have to show them a method to reorient. And even for those of us who might not seem to have a big problem in that area, I think that's the beauty of Hatha Yoga, is it teaches us to even go deeper and, again, see those things that we haven't quite been able to see. Maybe they're not much of a big step to get out of the way or walk around, but if we're that sensitive to the breath, then things become apparent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it also reminds me as you're talking that teachers will say to me, well, how am I going to know what's best for the student who's in front of me? And this is often a teacher who's newer to teaching, so I recognize there's a developmental process that we go through as yoga teachers, and it does require a kind of cultivation of the sensitivity in me or in another teacher to see the student kindly, wisely, compassionately, and wholly, and to see it selflessly, like not by my agenda for the student, not by the lens that I would prefer for the student, but through the tradition of and the teachings of yoga. That in the role of teacher, I actually have to take that selfless service seat and relax the lens that is Sarah Joy and feel more through the lens of yoga, so that I'm really offering to students what yoga would recommend here, rather than just what Sarah Joy would recommend. Because if my discomfort start arising in the company of a student, my recommendations will be filtered through my own unresolved material. So I really appreciate that time as a teacher, like some 25 years now, has cultivated that, like the actual art of that, and some awareness of it, and then practicing it, like being in the classroom for as many hours a week and a day as I am. How do you, in yourself, come to that kind of clarity that lets you walk into a yoga classroom and teach with heart and courage and selflessness to the students who are in front of you?
Yeah, as I go to teach, that seems like the very natural and only response. I think in getting to that point where it no longer becomes effort, actually for me, analyzing how Krishna taught Arjuna in the Bhagavad-Gita was one of the things that I've done. I think I've even taught some of that at your studio when I've been there. Because as you mentioned, when we're uncomfortable with somebody's situation through our lens, again, we want to ameliorate and diminish our discomfort, which is not going to lead us to making the best choice necessarily for the student. We have to be like that first chapter, you know. He waits till he's in the battle, ready to be shot arrows and things at him. And then when he throws down his weapons, like, now I'm going to teach you. Mm-hmm. So we have to sometimes be not so anxious to jump in. Right. Yet we also have to make our students safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great example from the Gita. Like, if we're too anxious to jump in, we might actually turn the student off, because their defenses are still up, and being too anxious to jump in can feel like disrespect to them.
And I definitely think it can hold them back from finding that mind-body connection, you know, that asana is so good at pointing out. If I keep correcting you before you feel the difference and can self-correct, you're going to learn an outward form that is approximately what you should do, and you will never get the sensitivity to know exactly what you as an individual should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, well said. Well, I want to ask you another question, and I know our time commitment is coming towards an end, so can I sneak this question in? Yeah, so the question is, when Arjuna then finally has the vision of Krishna, something extraordinary happens for him. And I would like your perspective on that revelation moment when Arjuna gets to see Krishna. What happens?
Excuse me. I missed a little bit of your audio there, but I did hear the question. Okay. At that point of revelation, when the fullness of connectivity, of unity of the universe is revealed, Arjuna can't take it, and he begs off. Basically, he gets fearful, and much as you said with the students getting afraid and just, despondent about the Gita starting out about war and killing. Arjuna can't stand seeing all these people being slaughtered in front of him. So his response is to ask Krishna to go back to a form with 4 arms and 2 heads so he can at least have some understanding of it, because the reality is so great and beyond normal human perception that it really is frightening. And again, this is also another reason that a teacher and a guide is needed no matter where you are, especially as you approach those depths.
Yeah, yes, awesome. Right, I love that moment in the Gita to talk to my students about it, because I know that in the course of practicing yoga and in the course of yoga teacher trainings and retreats that we have this shock of recognition or a revelation. We have this blazing insight that can also feel exciting but then terrifying. And a lot of insights don't turn into action.
And I do think that the setup of class, typical yoga workshops and weekends, and again, how we study and go about our practice have a big influence on that. And often, because in the yoga class, again, as a teacher, if you have a 3-hour, what we consider a long class, you can only let them go so far before you start bringing them back to a positive point to end on some sort of positive realization. And when teaching something a little longer, or a retreat that has some periods of greater silence, I find that really allows the students in a controlled setting to confront some of those things that they won't really have time to assimilate. They might see a solution, but not really understand it. Given a little more time and self-analysis rather than just hearing the solution, they'll be able to begin to work through the problems.
Yeah, that was very well said. Is there any one last thing that you'd like to share with our listeners about the Bhagavad-Gita or yoga?
I think I didn't hear the end of your question there, but if asking for one last thing about the Gita, I guess I would just want to share my passion and enjoyment for it, and the depths that's in those very few verses. And I'm probably a little embarrassed if I could count how many times I've read through the whole text and different portions of it. I have at least a couple of texts. One is the same translation, bought a second time because the first one wore out and fell apart. So keep digging into it. Try to transform it from being just this spiritual book or a book that you read to being a real guidebook, something that you can look for as a means to bounce your experience. Again, to really act, in a sense, as a teacher for each one of us. I think it really can serve us in that way.
Yes, yes. Which translation is that fell apart?
It was the one by Eknath Easwaran.
That's what I
very
thought.
Simple.
Mine fell apart too. Yeah, in fact,
And I don't think it's poor binding.
No, I don't think so either. I was going to order some more from Amazon.in, the Indian version of Amazon, because I bought my copy in India, so I had this romantic sense of needing to get another copy from India. Of course, you can get it here in the West too, but yeah, that's the one that fell apart for me also. Yeah. Good. Well, it's so lovely to talk with you like this, and I think our listeners are really blessed to have your wisdom and passion about the Gita and about yoga. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah Joy. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and again, to have anything to do with the great work that you've devoted yourself to. Again, kind of since I've known you, it really is, for me, an inspiration. And as a friend of yours, and here as a teacher, I get the additional advantage of occasionally getting to go into some of the situations and settings that you've set up. So I appreciate this very much.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that also. Namaste.
Namaste.